The Chalice of St. Mary. Breakfast in the garden meant that the table had to be placed so that the sun would not reflect on the laptop screen. At this hour, that was only possible if the table and chairs stood next to the dense thicket, the last impenetrable legacy of the cottage's previous owners. When Clarissa had finally arranged and adjusted everything, she sat down contentedly and took the first sip of tea. Black, without sugar. The laptop booted up. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and something sweet. Clarissa knew nothing about herbs. Perhaps there were some with that scent. She typed the first words into her writing program. Only the last 2 scenes were missing. Then she would send the first draft to her editor. But her stomach had other plans. It forced her to stand up and search for the cause of the sweet smell. They were not herbs. Where the thicket was densest, the body of Father Thomas lay. Clarissa regarded the scene with the cool distance of an expert. The priest lay among the branches. The sweet smell, which she had initially taken for something botanical, was now clearly identifiable. It came from the beginning decomposition that the warm morning sun was mercilessly accelerating. How long might he have been lying here? It had rained during the past few days, and she had not been in this part of the garden. In fact, she had hardly left her desk in order to make progress with her book. She stepped closer. The blowflies had already found him. Their metallic buzzing formed an ugly contrast to the peaceful chirping of the tits. The skin on his neck showed an unhealthy olive-green discoloration, and his hands looked unnaturally swollen. His black garment was dirty and torn at the sleeves. A dark, crusted bloodstain at the corner of his mouth, and the torn lapel indicated a struggle that must have taken place nights ago. Clarissa took her phone and dialed the number of the police. It took exactly 47 minutes before Inspector Hazelnut entered the garden. He headed straight for the thicket. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said, without looking at her, while examining his polished shoes. "I assume you felt the urge to personally improve the local crime statistics?" He walked past her without waiting for an answer and took his mobile phone out of his pocket. "Hazelnut here. Location of discovery. Rosewood. Cottage Hamilton. We have a victim, Father Thomas. Missing for 3 days. Send the forensics team and the hearse. Immediately." He began to mark off the area with yellow barrier tape, as if he were drawing a border between his world and her garden. He glanced at the dead man only briefly. "A professional job," Hazelnut murmured while tapping into his phone again. "The Chalice of St. Mary is missing from the sacristy. This is the work of an organized gang from London. Art theft, coldly calculated. The perpetrators are long gone." Clarissa took a sip of her black tea. It had already grown cold. She watched as Hazelnut secured the bushes only superficially, while his gaze kept wandering impatiently to his watch. "A gang, Inspector," she replied. Hazelnut snorted and ignored her casually. "Write your books, Clarissa. Leave the hunt for real criminals to the Oxford Criminal Police." Clarissa turned around and went back to the cottage. In the afternoon, Clarissa finished the first draft and sent the manuscript to her editor. She took a deep breath and decided that it would be a good time to begin a new crime novel, and the best beginning was still solid research. So she set out. The vicarage smelled of floor polish and stale incense. Mrs. Pringle opened the door only a crack. Her eyes were red, her apron crumpled. "Oh, it's you, Mrs. Hamilton. I thought it was the police again," she said hoarsely. "Mrs. Pringle, I wanted to offer you my condolences. I am so sorry. This must be terrible for you," Clarissa replied. "It is so terrible. The poor priest. How could anyone do such a thing to him? He was such a good man. But do come in first. Come in. We'll go into the kitchen and I'll make us some tea first." In the kitchen, they sat opposite each other. Mrs. Pringle shoveled sugar into her cup. "It calms the nerves," she said. "He was such a nice man. Everyone liked him. He had no enemies. How could something like this happen?" "I have no idea," said Clarissa, as she took a sip of tea. "I don't go to church, but I have heard that he was very popular in the parish." Mrs. Pringle paused, a brief trembling of her lips. "He was a good man. He was too good, too kind-hearted. He always tried to help everyone. He simply couldn't help it. He was far too good for this world." "He certainly was a good man," said Clarissa. "You probably knew him best. Has the police already informed his relatives? The poor things. So many people will miss him." The housekeeper sighed deeply. For a moment she seemed to struggle with herself. Her hands trembled as she raised the cup to her mouth. He had no family. His parents died a long time ago, and he had no siblings. Again a deep sigh escaped her. She bit her lips. Then she stood up abruptly. "More tea." It sounded more like an order than a question. "Very gladly," Clarissa answered gently, "but only if it's no trouble." "It isn't," said Mrs. Pringle, now somewhat more composed again. "And friends?" Clarissa asked. "Such a popular man must surely have had many friends." "He lived for his parish. Everyone in the parish was his friend. It is a terrible loss." Mrs. Pringle now began to sob. After all, Clarissa silently placed a hand on her arm. "I'm here," she said in a gentle voice. "If you want to talk, or even if you simply don't want to be alone, come over to my place. It's only a few steps away. I would be very glad." "Thank you. It must also have been terrible for you. I mean, finding him." "I do write about such things," said Clarissa, "but it is quite another matter when something so dreadful happens in reality. It isn't easy for me to be alone now, either." That same evening Mrs. Pringle sat on the couch in Clarissa's living room. On the coffee table stood 2 glasses, an empty wine bottle, a half-full carafe of sherry, and a mega-pack of paper tissues. Through tears, the priest's housekeeper had made a full confession and relieved her conscience. Now she had leaned back her head and produced regular, relaxed, snoring sounds. Clarissa took her notebook and wrote, "Affair 27 years ago, /London, /Mary Clark, /illegitimate son. Julian. Drug problems /financial support. PT no longer wanted to /Julian suspicious. Motive. Desperation. Needs money for drugs." She closed the book and placed it on her desk. Then she fetched a wool blanket and wrapped the sleeping woman in it. Clarissa sat at her desk, her gaze fixed on the flickering cursor. The first chapter of the new novel almost wrote itself. She typed the name Mary Clark into the search field. London was large, but the logic of a man like Father Thomas was predictable. He would not have placed Mary somewhere at random. He would have chosen a place far enough away to protect Rosewood, but close enough to a railway line to Oxford. The laptop hummed softly. Clarissa took a sip of tea. Among the results appeared an old address in Paddington that was listed in church records for social support. A hit. "Paddington," she murmured. She closed the laptop. She smiled at the thought of how Hazelnut was chasing shadows in vans on the motorway. She, on the other hand, now had a concrete target, the Clark family. She felt a slight tingling in the back of her neck, an infallible sign that she was right. This Julian would certainly try to turn his loot into cash, but which fence would dare to sell the stolen Chalice of St. Mary's? Only one who already knew private collectors, and he would not be doing it for the first time. The next day, Mrs. Pringle led Clarissa into the priest's study. She had made a decision. She would no longer remain silent. The perpetrator had to be caught, even if it really should be Julian. It smelled of old paper. The housekeeper pointed with a trembling hand at the heavy mahogany secretary. "At first he said it was for the poor in London," she whispered. "Only after a few years did he confide in me and reveal his secret, and eventually even their names." "And you kept it," Clarissa said sympathetically. "All these years you remained silent." "I did," murmured Mrs. Pringle. "I loved him. I would have done anything for him." Clarissa turned back to the piece of furniture. Carefully she felt along every part of it, and indeed, one drawer had a false bottom. "Handwritten receipts," she murmured. "Lots of them. The oldest ones are already quite old. Quite a lot has accumulated here. I don't know exactly, but it was clear to me that he kept exchanging valuable things for cheap copies." "He sold the treasures of the church," said Clarissa, "piece by piece, probably to send money to his family, to finance his son's addiction, and the detox treatments, the stays in clinics, the therapies," corrected Mrs. Pringle with a last remnant of loyalty. "At least in recent years, but it was useless. It only got worse. But the chalice was the limit. He told me he could not steal from God any more." "There is a business card here. Arthur Pembroke, Antiques," murmured Clarissa. "Do you know him?" "No," answered Mrs. Pringle. "I didn't ask. I looked the other way all of these years." The next day, Clarissa drove to Oxford. Arthur Pembroke's antique shop was as orderly as a well-run archive. The owner himself was a well-groomed elderly gentleman with full white hair and an aristocratic bearing. He wore an expensive suit and, despite his age, moved with smooth elegance. "Good day, Mr. Pembroke. I come on behalf of Father Thomas," said Clarissa, watching Pembroke polish a silver box. "It concerns the Chalice of St. Mary." Pembroke placed the box on a small table and turned to the visitor. "Good day, Mrs. Hamilton." "Mrs. Hamilton, I'm very sorry, but I know no Father Thomas." "And you probably don't know Julian Clark either," said Clarissa with a friendly smile. "Then please excuse the disturbance. I must have mistaken the address." A week later, the parish gathered to attend the funeral service of their highly esteemed priest. Clarissa observed the scene from the back of the church. The light fell pale through the high windows and illuminated the simple oak coffin that had been laid out before the altar. Inspector Hazelnut stood at the side entrance, his arms folded, his gaze directed impatiently at his watch. A young priest from a neighbouring parish read the funeral service. Outside, the air was damp and smelled of wet earth. A fine drizzle fell, yet the air was spring-like and warm. Birds sang in the branches. The funeral procession moved out of the church and stopped in front of a freshly dug grave. While the priest recited prayers, Clarissa watched the people. She had not lived in the village very long, but she knew everyone gathered here. Quietly, she moved away a little. At the edge of the cemetery, a gaunt figure with a hood sat on a gravestone. Clarissa approached from behind. "I am sure he forgave you, Julian," she said, without introduction. The young man spun around. His eyes were wide open, his pupils dilated. "What?" he gasped, jumped up, and ran. But he did not get far. He ran straight into Inspector Hazelnut's arms. "Stop him!" Clarissa shouted as loudly as she could. "He murdered the priest!" Hazelnut did not understand what she meant, but he reacted instantly. He grabbed the fugitive. "He murdered his father," Clarissa explained, whereupon Hazelnut almost let the young man go again because he thought she was completely insane. "His father?" Hazelnut asked. "Have you completely lost your mind?" "Just do your job," Clarissa said coolly and turned away. She walked along the path back to her cottage. The thicket in her garden had meanwhile been trimmed. The disorder had been cleared away. The light of the evening sun fell unobstructed onto her desk as she opened the lid of her laptop